Take my stand, yeah. I am a roaring lamb. I am a roaring lamb, and the time has come to take my stand, yeah.
Hello, I'm Donna Skell.
And I'm Tiffany Ross.
Welcome to Roaring Lambs. We're a ministry that wants to change the culture for Christ by equipping and inspiring Christians to amplify their faith, to share their story of how they know Jesus is real. And today we have an amazing roaring lamb with us today. Now, the roaring lion sought to destroy her, but she called on Jesus and he came to the rescue. Imagine this, your 2-year-old baby is crying in the bedroom, and you go in and you lift her out of the crib, and there's not anybody else in the room, but she's saying, he bit me, and all of a sudden you look down and her arm is just covered with bite marks. That's the kind of story we have for you today. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back.
This episode of Roaring Lambs is brought to you by LifeStoriesCompany.com.
You know, I'm intrigued with the word evil because spelled backwards, it is live. And to live in this world is to experience evil. This is an evil world, and we have a guest today who will have a real impactful story for you to describe how she dealt with evil. Sandy Boyd is a pastor's wife. She's an author, and I'm proud to say that Roaring Lambs published her book, Transformed, and it is available on Amazon and I'm sure on Sandy's website as well. She has been featured on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and she's done numerous talks about this. She shared her testimony all over the place. She traveled with the Bill Glass Ministries behind the walls in prisons and shared her story, and she's going to share it with you today. So welcome, Sandy. So glad to have you on the Roaring Lambs TV show.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. And we just don't want to waste any more time. So let's start at the beginning of the story. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your early years.
Okay. Well, I was introduced to witchcraft by my grandmother at a very early age. I have 2 older sisters, and so they encouraged me and kind of helped me as well. My grandmother gave us spell books and taught us how to do incantations. And so we
can you define even what incantation would mean?
Yes, incantations are a repetitive ritual to where you would summon spirits and open like portholes of hell. Of course, at that time we didn't think that hell had anything to do with it. We thought we were talking to people's lost, loved ones that had passed on and in the spirit world, and we were given familiar spirits that were to look out for us and watch over us as we lived our life, and they were there to protect us, is what we were told. And so, we would have spirits come and speak to us. We had one specific spirit, as I mentioned before, it was a familiar spirit who lived in our house. And things would happen that would protect us. For instance, there was a fire in our kitchen, and everyone was sleeping. It was about 2 in the morning, and I woke up to crashing dishes and flying dishes all over the kitchen as cabinets were opening up, and I ran into the kitchen, and the curtains were on fire. And so my parents, because of all of the noise, they woke up, they ran down the hall, and the last thing that my parents told me was, "See, we told you that this spirit will protect us." She was trying to wake somebody up to let us know that there was a fire in the house. And so there were several occasions when I felt protected by this familiar spirit that we were assigned. And so my parents were totally on board with it. We even gave her a name. Her name was Mrs. Corral. And so we would talk to her about things, what would happen in our future. And of course, we were kids and all the good fun. We would have seances with our friends down the street. And we would ask these spirits, you know, who would I marry and how many children am I going to have? And they would answer us.
Wow.
And so we thought that it was all in good fun, and this was normal in our household at that time.
Was it ever scary for you, these spirits? Did it ever evoke fear within you?
When
as a child?
Yes, at times when I would have real evil dreams and nightmares, and there was one occasion when I had the same dream for 3 consecutive nights. And I think that was the first time that I really felt fear be instilled in me. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And during this time, these dreams we lived in a valley in this dream, and there was like a black darkness that would come over the valley every night at a certain time. And I remember I would know that when the sun would set that this darkness was coming, so I would crawl under the table and try and hide. And so it would pass over, and then the next night it picked up right back over. It was the next night again, and it would come over. And the very last night, the black and the darkness that came over was so intense that it blew the roof off of the home that I was in. And the table I was hiding under just completely crumbled, and I was taken up into this darkness. And that was really the first time in my life that I ever had, but I didn't really associate it with my familiar spirit, because you see, she was there to protect me. And so I called out to this familiar spirit to help me and protect me, whatever the dream meant. And so there was darkness, but in my mind there was darkness, and then there was my familiar spirit that would bring me peace and bring me protection.
Wow, how dangerous. Now I know it was your grandparents or your grandmother that introduced you to this witchcraft
Yes.
at a very early age, but your dad certainly didn't help, because he also introduced you to Satanism and drugs
Yes.
at what, 9 years old?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes, my grandmother, well, it really wasn't in the picture when I was that age. They would travel. They were both professors, and so they would travel the world. And so my dad took it a step further, and he introduced me to drugs for the first time when I was 9. And it just started out with smoking pot, and just to gain that control. I look back now and I see the purpose for his actions. And then it slowly went to methamphetamines and then cocaine. And by the time I was 10, I was so addicted to these drugs. That's when he really came in and started introducing the occult aspect of it and the Satanism aspect of it. And I lost my virginity with my own dad when I was 10 years old during a sexual sacrifice. And I was so addicted to these drugs that I was willing to do anything, and that's exactly where he wanted me. He had complete control over my life. And I didn't realize at the time that this would go on even after I got married, even into adulthood. There was still that bondage that he had over my life.
Sandy, you have a sister, correct? You had a sister?
Yes, I have 2 sisters.
All right. And what happened with the psychiatric hospital and that?
So when my dad introduced me to drugs, now all of this was going on with my sisters. They were older than me, but it was strange. It was really a strange dynamic because we never talked about it. Something totally different was going on with my older sister, that was going on with my middle sister, that was going on with me. And we never talked about it. It was something that I didn't know that was really going on with them, and they didn't know what was happening to me. It was like we were living these separate lives, but under the same roof.
Were you threatened? Did your dad threaten you? Don't say anything? And
Yes,
oh, okay.
yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Don't say anything. And I'm sure he told my sisters that as well. But my middle sister, she was very stubborn, very rebellious, and she would run away from home, and she was in jail a couple times, and she was very adamant to not conform to the ways that my dad wanted her to. I mean, just a simple request, she would buck up against him. And so she, in order for my parents just to keep her contained, they just put her in a psychiatric hospital.
Wow.
And she was 2 years older than me. And so she was quite young when she was committed. And I remember my parents would take me to see her, and she would try and sit up in bed, and she'd have these open sores in her mouth because of all the medications. They had her going through electric shock treatments. And at the time, back in the day, they would give them elephant tranquilizers. And so she was not even coherent when I would see her. And I would walk out of there just crying, and my dad would, this is what would happen to you. This is what's going to happen to you as we walked out of that facility. And so I not only was addicted to the drugs and was being controlled on that level, but I was also being controlled due to the threats and what I was seeing was going on with my sister. And this went on until my sister was pretty much old enough to sign herself out of the hospital
My goodness.
as an adult, and that's where she stayed.
How traumatic
Yeah.
for your sister.
Yes.
And for you.
Yes.
So at age 17, you finally just run away from all this. right?
Exactly. Yes.
Tell us about that.
I thought I was running away and all of this would be behind me. I didn't realize the spiritual dynamic of everything, along with the continual addiction to the drugs. I just thought to myself, well, I could, find my own means of financial gain to get my drugs, and that led me into a life of prostitution. And I went into exotic dancing and just basically stayed and lived with anyone who would take me. My dad, however, because he was so involved and entrenched in the occult, he had occult members that he had assigned to watch over me. And so it didn't matter where I ran from state to state trying to get away from him. I got married thinking that if my name changed that, he would lose contact with me, and it never worked. And I didn't realize the spiritual dynamic of it all.
Right.
There was not only the addiction, which was really the minor problem. The major problem was the spiritual aspect of what was going on.
Yeah.
I was dedicated to Satan as a child, and in his mind, I belonged to him. And there was no way out of that lifestyle. And my dad was a constant reminder of that. And so I didn't have any way out at that point, and I believed the lies that he told me.
So you get married and you have a son.
Yes, I get married and have a son, and I was still addicted to the drugs and needed financial money to support that. And my dad would come and show up at the door and, here's the drugs, and of course it was just a vicious cycle, and I would just fall right back into that pattern. And it didn't take long before my husband got tired of what was going on and really didn't understand what was going on the spiritual level. And we got divorced. And I tried to keep custody of my little boy. We lived here in Texas at the time. And I didn't have any family here. I could have called my dad and he could have brought us underground, kidnapped my son, and, that I would have brought my son into that cycle as well. Instead, I chose to live in my car, get a part-time job to cover up my lifestyle, and the authorities caught up with me within the month, and I lost total custody of my little boy. And I was left to resorting back to my dad and the prostitution and out on the streets of Dallas-Fort Worth. And I remember there was a time when I knew, and it finally sunk in, that I was not going to be able to see my little boy. He was my life. To me, he was the only thing foundational, the only one that would love me unconditionally and with no strings attached. Of course, he was only 2.5, 3 years old at the time, but he was everything to me. And when I realized, going down the road with my husband driving, I realized what really was going on. And when I realized that I would never see my son again, I opened the car door and I jumped out of the car while it was going. I would have rather died than to lose my son. And I ended up in the hospital and, you know, recovered from that. But the emotional scars and everything else that went along with that were still there.
So at this point, your husband divorced you
Yes.
and took custody of
And
your
left the
son.
state, yes.
So that left you back in the same place that you had been before,
Yes.
dependent on finding a way to make some money to continue your habit and to try to survive.
Yes.
And you met another man at that
I did,
point.
and we got married, and him and I had a daughter together, and we moved to Washington State at that time. Well, my sister had recently gotten out of the psychiatric hospital, and so, you know, so I did have some family there in Washington, but I was still an addict. There was still those strongholds, those bondages that, you know, were still attached to me, and I didn't realize it until later, becoming a Christian, what all of that really meant, and being totally disconnected from those demonic chains that kept me in bondage. And we ended up getting divorced, and because my sister lived there in Washington, I kept custody of my little girl and moved in with her. And at that time, it was a very bad combination. You know, she was just coming out of the hospital, trying to get off all of the medications they had her on, and I was still an addict, and we started getting back into doing seances and calling on our familiar spirits that we thought had always helped us, even though our life was a mess. You know, I should have known then at that point, what have they helped us with? You know, because our life was just a mess at that time. But it was a place to stay and a roof over my head, and so my daughter and I lived with her.
So I have a question, Sandy. During this time, you know, about how old are you at this point at your sister's?
I was about 23.
Okay. You've already lived quite a life up to 23.
Yes.
Had you, throughout your lifetime, interacted with any Christians, any people that you knew were Christians? And if you had heard about Jesus, even in the periphery, was there any emotion that stirred in you, like, that's not truth, or
Yeah.
I don't want that? Or
Yeah, well, that's interesting you would ask that question, because back in my early days, when my grandmother was in the picture, my sisters and I went to see the movie Jesus Christ Superstar.
Huh.
And I don't know what led us to that movie, but we watched that movie. We must have went to see that movie 12 times. We knew it by heart. We would sit through that movie, and it was a musical.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
we would sing through the people were telling us, be quiet, you know, because we knew every word. And do you know, I look back now and I think that movie somehow, even at the end of the movie, it was just a play and it was a musical, and there was no death, burial, resurrection. But in the same sense, there was a Jesus. And it never dawned on me until I became a Christian, and my husband brought that up as well. He said, you know, really that movie was not meant to convert people.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, but yet it put something in you that God used even throughout the time that I was living that life.
Yeah.
I still in my heart knew that there was a Jesus.
Wow.
And I didn't realize that until after I got saved at 29 years old.
Wow.
Wow. So going back, you're living at your sister's house. You're not living a good lifestyle. And you reach a point of despair. You just know that nothing good is going to happen if you continue in that path, and you go out into your car one night and you had some really bad intentions.
Yes.
So bring us up to date on
Yes,
that.
yes. Well, what led me there was that I knew I had to break free. I didn't know what to do to break free. In my mind, me not living on this earth and my daughter being in the hands of foster parents or someone who could adopt her could give her a better life than me.
And she was 2 years
And
old.
she
at
was
this
2 years
time.
old. She was 2 years old at the time. And I remember laying in my bed before I made the decision to take my life. I was laying in bed one night and a black hooded figure came and stood at the end of my bed and he said, "It's time." And at first I thought it was a dream. And he said, "It's time." And I sat up and I said, "I don't understand," because I wasn't familiar with the demonic spirits on this level. You know, this wasn't something I had encountered in my experience before. And he said, "It's time now for you to teach your daughter what your grandmother had taught you." Well, little did I know, as I mentioned, my grandmother was really not in the picture after that. But little did I know that the next day when I called my mother informed me that my grandmother had passed away a week prior to that.
Wow.
And I realized, even not being a Christian at this time, that this was something that was to be passed on. It went from my mother, and who knows how much further, my grandmother, my mother, to my sisters, myself, and now we were to continue this cycle to our children, the next generation. And that's what led me to take my life. I could not protect her from something I could not see.
So you took a razor blade.
I took a razor blade and I went out to a field and I leaned my seat back as I cried because I knew that I wasn't going to see my little girl anymore or my son. And both of my hands fell to the side. And in between my console and my seat, I felt something. Now remember, I had this car. I got this car from my drug dealer. I had the car for at least 3 years prior to this. I knew the car inside and out. And as I felt something between the console and my seat, I picked up this New Testament Gideon Bible.
That wasn't there before.
It was not there before.
Certainly didn't belong to the previous owner.
No, and I didn't know any Christians. That's all I knew was this was a little book that said the New Testament, Psalms and Proverbs. I understood the New Testament part, but I didn't have any idea what Psalms and Proverbs meant, so I started thumbing through this little Bible. And confused and working through the tears, I set the razor blade down and I turned to the back of the book and there was the sinner's prayer. And I said the sinner's prayer and gave my life to Jesus Christ that day in the front seat of my car.
Would you read the sinner's prayer so that
Well, I don't
everybody...
have my glasses on.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
sorry. Yes, but it's a basic sinner's prayer of all who have come short of the glory of God and all who have sinned against him are in need of a Savior.
Right.
And I repeated this thing over and over and over in my heart, and I literally felt a peace come upon me that I have never felt. My familiar spirit could never give me this peace. All the seances in the world that I could perform never gave me this peace. So I wrote the date down, which was June 30th, 1993. I gave my life to Jesus in the front seat of my car that day, and I knew that I knew in my heart that there was hope. And I heard an audible, still, soft voice say, "You go and you get your daughter because I am your father now. I am the father that you need. I am the father that will save you and deliver you and who you have been looking for." So I went and I picked up my daughter, and believe me, all the way there, it was about a 40-minute drive, and I said the sinner's prayer over and over because it was the only thing that brought me peace. It was the only thing I knew would bring me hope. So I went and I picked her up, and we went back to the apartment that night. My sister wanted me to go and get some drugs to do a drug run for her. And I absolutely refused. She got so angry that she grabbed me by the hair and dragged me out into the front yard. And do you know, for the first time in my life, being punched on and dragged out by my hair, I felt the peace that God gave me.
Wow.
I wasn't fighting back. I wasn't resisting. I knew that God had me, even in the midst of all of that.
Yeah.
So she got angry and she left for the night, and I laid my daughter down in her crib. And about 30 minutes later, I heard her screaming. And I got up and ran into her room, and her toys were flying across the room, just like those dishes that I had explained to you. They were flying across the room. The ceiling fan was spinning so quickly, I thought it was literally going to drop to the floor. And as I worked my way to my daughter, I picked her up, and she said, "Mommy, they are biting me. They're biting me." And I picked her up and I looked at her forearm, and there were bite marks, teeth marks on her forearm, and she was bleeding from her arm. And I knew at that moment this was something that I had no control over. I didn't know what was going on really in the spiritual realm. I didn't know that there was a war going on over my soul.
Right.
Until the next day, I called my first husband's dad, who had been an evangelist before I ever even knew him. And I told him what was going on, and I told him that I had given my life to Jesus Christ. And he said, "Sandy, I had no idea." And he said, "But I will tell you this. Now that you have given your life to Jesus Christ, you are no longer the enemy's, and he knows it.
Yes.
You no longer belong to Satan. It doesn't matter if you were dedicated to him. You dedicated your life to Jesus Christ and that of your daughter." And he said, "You need to find a good church, get plugged into a church." But he really knew that I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay there in the area with all the influences and all the people and all the familiar lifestyle and all the people who were after me. And so he invited me to come back to Texas, and him and his wife had just started a church. And so him and his wife paid for a ticket for my daughter and I to fly to Texas, and that's what we did. We slept in the sanctuary because their church was in their house. We slept in their living room in the sanctuary, and they're the presence of God. And I was so hated by my family. My mom, my dad, "You are serving the wrong God. What are you doing? We are ashamed of you. You've been a mockery to our family." Even my son, he was probably 7 at the time, but because he knew that I didn't live in the area anymore, said, "Mommy, I hate you. You left me again."
Oh.
And I couldn't go back. I could not go back because I had my daughter. I had something that I had no idea what was in front of me, but I knew I didn't ever want to go to what was behind me.
Right. Right.
And like you said, the battle, once you chose Jesus, the battle was on. It was already
Yes.
raging, but it increased, and the devil really wanted to torment you some more. What
Yes.
else happened?
Yes. So after that, we just, my ex-father-in-law was just such a blessing. He helped me through all of the withdrawals, all of the sorrow, all of the pain of my family rejecting me. And through him and the body of Christ showed me that they were my family. You know, they're my family now. And they're the ones that taught me to teach my daughter. And I remember sitting in the foyer because my daughter was so tormented, I wasn't able to go into the sanctuary during the services. But I would sit at that time it was their front porch. And I would sit out there with her while she was screaming and writhing on the ground. And I would just cry and cry because I couldn't be in there listening to God's word. And the little elderly ladies would come out and say, "Honey, you just go in there and you listen to God's word. Let us take care of your little girl." And so they would take her somewhere. And And God was teaching me how to teach her. But the whole body of Christ joined together to love me and teach me and give me the tools that I needed to be able to fight this battle.
And so you met a Christian man and married, and he became the children's minister
Yes.
at the church.
Yes.
And so you felt like your life was on the right track and things were going to go perfectly according to God's will. But like Tiffany said, the devil was still after you
Yes.
at that point.
Yes.
What happened then?
Yes. Well, as like you said, I did. I thought that this was a Christian man. He's been in church all of his life, and he really didn't understand where I was coming from. He didn't understand the spiritual darkness or
Right.
the dynamic of. He didn't know what he was getting into. And he had a little boy that was at about the same age as my son, and so I really thought, God, you are restoring back to me everything that the enemy has stolen from me. And so we were married. He was the children's pastor. We were going to a bigger church at this time. And my kids were growing up. We were teaching them in the ways of the Lord. And my daughter turned 9, 10 years old around the same time I was when all this happened. And my husband molested her. And when she came and told me, Mommy, Daddy's touching me, Daddy's doing this, I immediately thought, how could I let this happen again? How could I allow this? Why didn't I see the signs? And at that moment, understand, we were married for 12 years. To her, that was her daddy. And his son, I was his mother. And so we were a family. And my husband admitted to everything. He stepped down as the children's pastor. We had to go through a bitter divorce battle. My daughter and I had to leave the area because it was so bad and try and pick up the pieces of our life and move on. And my daughter was very angry. She was very bitter. And I thought, God, how are you going to fix this now? And I blamed myself. I honestly blamed myself because I had been through this and I should have seen the signs. So my daughter went off to, I was being counseled by a gentleman named Scott, and he had spent years, as a matter of fact, he's much younger than me, but much wiser. And he had spent many years on a sabbatical, and God had told him, before I even knew him, had led him to read the Frank Peretti books, to delve into all of the spiritual sexual sacrifices, the demonic realm, what goes on in satanic rituals, and he spent years dedicating his life to that. And I believe now, looking back, that God had prepared him just for me.
Yes.
And my daughter.
Wow.
Because when we met and he was counseling me for some time, he suggested that my daughter go to this summer camp with a church that he had belonged to at that time. And so she did. And while at that camp, she was so touched by God. Now, when she left, she hated every man. She hated the counselor, Scott. She hated preachers. She hated, and rightfully so, as a 12-year-old
Yes,
girl.
yes.
And she was so bitter and full of hate. And when she went to this camp, she stayed there for a week. And she came back, and she was a totally different young lady. And we were told by the youth pastor that she had been prayed for one night, and she fell out on the ground and was laying there on the ground, sobbing and sobbing for 4 hours on the floor.
Wow.
The service was over, and they had to carry her out of the service. And God had so touched her life. That's all he needed. was 4 hours with her on that floor. Not one person could have done that.
Yep.
And she came back a loving child, forgiving. She wanted to apologize for how she was acting. And God just transformed her. And from that point on, my counselor and I got closer, and we ended up getting married and started a church together in Garland, Texas called River of Life Fellowship. And we minister to women coming out of sexual abuse, addiction, and not just women. I mean, everybody knows someone who has been addicted to drugs. And God has just made a path. And we are just the vessels, and He is the miracle worker.
And God is using you and Scott all over, not just by writing this book, Transformed, but you go and you speak and you travel to different churches. And Brianna, your 2-year-old daughter, is now 31.
Yes.
And she's beautiful, and she looks
Aw.
just like you.
Oh, thank
And you look like sisters, as a matter